Welcome everyone to another webinar. Today, my name is Rodrigo Silva. I am the Communications Manager at Cogitatio, and today we are discussing how smart cities adapt to climate change. This topic of today in discussion is based on a thematic issue that we published in our open access journal, Urban Planning, a few weeks ago. And to present this topic, allow me to present our speakers. We have Thomas Thaler from the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Austria. He is one of the co-editors of this issue. We also have Juliane Wright from TU Dortmund University in Germany, and Daniela Maiullari from Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands and Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden. They are both authors of our issue. Also, we have the pleasure of welcoming Jonas Bylund from JPI Urban Europe in Austria to provide a professional opinion on the topic at hand today. Allow me to provide you all with more information concerning today's webinar. So this is the order of presentations. Thomas will open our session, followed by Juliane, Daniela, and then Jonas. After that, we will jump to the Q&A with our audience. So to our attendees, you are free to write your questions throughout the whole session to our speakers using the Q&A format on the bottom of your screen. We kindly ask you to write the name of the person to whom you're directing your question. Also, if you are on Twitter, you are free to follow us, the handle that you can see also on the bottom of your screen at Cogitatio Up, to be in touch with our publications, call for papers, the impact of our research on news outlets, on blogs, etc. Without further delay, I would like to wish you all a pleasant webinar and pass the word to Thomas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. Thank you very much, everyone. Good afternoon also from Vienna. Thanks a lot. This is a great pleasure from my side to present our special issue as one of the co-editors. We are in total 4 ones. You can figure out our special issue published a couple of weeks ago, I think 2 months ago in Urban Planning. And the question was, Rodrigo asked me, what was the main motivation of this special issue, why we worked on it. And in fact, it was quite interesting story. It's a short story, is that this is actually based on a JPI Urban project started a couple of years ago in 2017, so-called Flood Label. The project finished last year in March 2020. And the main motivation for our project is the Aeronet project. This is still valid also for the special issue over here. The idea was, and the problem is why we should take care about such information is, okay, we have climate change, everyone knows it, but the question is how we can respond, adapt to this threat of climate change, which means that in the near future, or also long term, that the impacts, so it means we will expect more intensive extreme events, will have also higher intensive losses for the near future. And urban areas are very special, not only because a lot of people living there, and we also have JPI Urban on board, but no, the urban community is really interesting for many issues because they have quite a lot of threats. We are not only talking about the flooding issue, but we also have extreme heat waves, such as like this summer or last year's summers. And sometimes we're forgetting about it, we have extreme cold events in the winter, where we have really freezing, where a lot of people are dying. And that was the question about our project and also about this special issue, how we can find solutions, ideas, concepts to respond to this extreme situation, which is not the normal daily life, what we are dealing with extreme ordinary issues. This multiple dimensions, urban area, very different people from social excluded people. We have some green spaces, no green spaces. We have infrastructure very aging, not only in the States, but also in Europe. So we are facing quite a lot of different problems. The order and the idea behind it for us was, okay, we want to see one particular issue that was so-called smart situation. Smart in terms of technologies, smart also in terms of governance, how we can introduce new technologies, new ideas, for example, in our daily life, to find maybe some adequate responses to this climate change threat. The question is also here, how are we organizing it? As we know, most of you know, there are some big industrial companies, such like Siemens and IBM, which are really promoting smartness. So this is a private company. How we can integrate this private company in terms of transparency, how we can include them, or are there closed door by door definitions? Or we have another example, such as like the city of Barcelona, which try to encourage large people in this participation process. But that means also it's not so straightforward, easygoing, saying, well, people, please join with your smartphone. No, it means we need some new governance arrangements and structures, how we can interact with participation, how we can interact with people who has no mobile device, how we can interact with elderly people, with young people. And that opened quite a lot of questions, but we were not fully able to answer in our project. And so we thought, maybe let's have a look outside of our box, our project box, and see other examples in Europe, outside of Europe. And that was the wonderful situation with this special issue, that we have quite a range of different papers dealing with different countries across the globe with different methodologies, working on more modeling side over to more governance side. And that was the main interesting part of this special issue, which most of them also providing very interesting policy recommendations, how we can interact to provide some concrete advices to the urban areas for policymakers, how they need to adapt this new technology. It's not like homeschooling or home office. No, it's a little bit more how we can make a democratic, transparent situation of smart governance. And that was also the main challenge, but also the main issues what we have. And that one of the situations also how we deal with a certain issue, which policymakers totally hate us. The question about uncertainties, the question about we don't find one number, we figure out different numbers. And that's also interaction with policymakers start to rethink by themselves. That's not only 5 million euros. No, there are different impacts and different solutions that ends up this complex thinking where we think smart technology might be useful, but there also needs some boundary condition. And therefore, I'm very happy that two of the presenters, Juliane and Daniela, as next ones, are presenting some concrete results. I'm not talking too much because I don't like to be a spoiler too much. And therefore, I would like to say, let's go to the next one and I will stop talking about the editorial issue. Thank you very much and see you maybe later.
Thank you, Thomas, for this context of the discussion. Juliane, please.
Thank you. Thank you. And hello from Dortmund, from Germany. I'm really happy to be here and to show our results or to tell you about our results. I'm a researcher at the Technical University here, and I'm working in 2 research projects addressing climate adaptation in more rural areas, which is quite interesting because at the moment they're not so present in the whole discussion. I will come back to that later. But our main idea was to have a comparison of a German approach and a Dutch approach, to figure out similarities and differences, and also to improve our own research and our own approach. And we had a look at 2 sides. So on the one hand, the analysis, which I feel is the basis or should be the basis for every discussion. And on the other hand, the output. So how can we use the output for the further discussion? How do the actors, stakeholders use these results? So that was our key question. And what we found out is that it's really important to have a structured analysis on both sides, on the side of the climate stressors. So for example, heat, drought, heavy rain, or also river flooding. But also on the other hand, the sensitivity. So it's not only about the climate stresses, it's also about the space where are especially sensitive people or especially sensitive, for example, agriculture or forest. So our idea was to have a really big space. We have 100 municipalities in North Rhine-Westphalia that we work with. So it's quite a large project. And also many different subjects from heat and urban areas, but also, for example, drought and rural areas. And what we found out is that it's really important to have a clear starting point. In the Netherlands, it's not formal, not like they don't have to do it, but they found a clear starting point where all municipalities said, okay, here we start, we do this analysis and we go through the whole process. And here in Germany or in North Rhine-Westphalia, we have a federal system. It's still quite, here somebody starts and somebody else starts, but it's not this whole process with a bunch of people who do the whole process together. So I think that's one really important result, that we need to find a starting point together and go the process together. Also, we found out that there's a big challenge of complexity on the one hand. So we have so much data, we have so much information, we bring the data together, but on the other hand, we need to prepare the data for the right stakeholders. So which stakeholders need which information to be able to adapt? So that was the second big question, also first result. We're working on a second publication to figure out this question a bit more. And also the big challenge to implement new tools into municipalities. So I will just briefly share my screen to give you an idea what we are working on. It's not possible, so maybe I will not share my screen, or it can be changed quickly. Otherwise, I will just, no, that doesn't work. Okay. Anyway, we developed an interactive tool where you can have different options of choosing what you want to look at. And it's not very, it's not very easy to implement this new tool into municipalities. So that's another challenge that we're facing. And if I want to answer the question, how does this impact society as a whole, or how does it impact climate adaptation? I think the first result that we found out, climate impacts will increase. So all our analysis that we made show a clear increase for the future. Also, we also talked about that before, an uncertainty. So we know that something is increasing, but we don't know how exactly. So we try to show like a bandwidth of different possible futures that we might have to adapt to show a variety of possible futures. So maybe it's possible now to, no, okay, just checked again if I can share my screen. So that's the second part, that we really need to get these new tools into the municipalities to show this wide variety of climate impacts. And if you look at rural areas, as I just said, it's not just about heat, as we discussed, it's also about agriculture, about forestry, about drought. And these are issues that are not very present in the discussion at the moment. So we need to talk about these problems as well. As I said before, it's really important to show the results for the stakeholders. And that's something that we really learned from the Netherlands, because they really prepare the information for the right stakeholders. So on the one hand, they have really simple pictures just showing how does the climate impact space, very basic pictures. And then they have a map showing correlations. And then they have really specific data where you can zoom into a lot of details. So we need different levels of information to reach the right stakeholders. Let me check. Yeah. From our side, we have the goal to find a methodology that we can implement for the whole of North Rhine-Westphalia. So we have the problem that we don't have like threshold values, or values that we can say, with this value, we need to adapt. It's also a political discussion. When do we adapt? When do we say, okay, we can cope with this? So that's a political decision. So we said, okay, we take all of the data that we have and compare the data to see the comparable climate impact. So our goal is to have a big variety of data, to make it as big as we can, basically, to then answer this question, how large is the climate impact? So that's what we're working on at the moment, and we want to find out more about the usability of such new tools, about the usability also in rural areas to overcome issues such as missing resources, for example, in small municipalities, and bring the information there, because in my opinion, it's often not the problem that we don't have the information, but we need to prepare the information and bring it to the wide audience. So basically, I think that's the main findings for now. I'm sure that in the discussion we can go more into details, but maybe I will pass on the word to Daniela for the moment.
Juliane, thank you very much for an interesting presentation. We'll be now hearing from Daniela Maiullari.
Thanks. Good afternoon from Gothenburg. First of all, I would like to thank you for organizing this webinar and for the opportunity you're giving us to share a few reflections on this article, a quantitative morphological method for mapping local climate types. I'm saying us because this article was co-written with Marjolein Pijper-van Asch and Arjen van Timmeren, and builds on our research activities at TU Delft in the last years, in which we have been closely working with city authorities. And in this context, we have been observing the difficulties that municipalities encounter in defining climate action plans, more in general in defining guidelines for climate change adaptation. So specifically, I would say that one of the main challenges regards the support instruments to address urban overheating risk caused both by heat waves and urban heat island effect. Now, we know that urban warming not only creates disruption in the infrastructural systems, but also strongly affect energy consumption of buildings and well-being of people. However, it risks analytical and mapping instruments to support climate adaptive planning have still, I would say, a few limitations. Among others, the large aggregative units that are using climate maps and the use of homogeneous patterns for classifications, homogeneous urban fabric patterns for classification. So an issue that we approach in this paper is the need of analyzing increasingly complex and heterogeneous built environments, and the need also to increase the spatial resolution of heat risk maps. And a question might be, why is this important? Well, in the last decades, many European cities have been following the paradigm of compact and dense sustainable urban development. And this has often resulted in redensification processes of existing areas, increasing also the morphological heterogeneity of the urban fabric, and somehow also reopening this endless debate around what we call the compact city paradox. In fact, from a climate perspective, higher built density can increase the magnitude of urban heat island effect and overheating in general in cities. So we recognized that not only it is necessary to have analytical instruments to support understanding of increasingly complex urban fabric, but also it is necessary to have instruments to describe in detail morphological and microclimate heterogeneity to then facilitate the implementation of mitigation measures. So in this direction, we developed what we call the local climate type framework, which is, I know, a very complicated way of describing it, but this is a morpho-based microclimate classification system, and it is intended as complementary to the other approach that exists now in climatology. In fact, maybe many of you are familiar with the local climate zone framework, and here the difference of our approach is that our approach allows to characterize separately building types and their surrounding condition, and this can facilitate then the understanding of the thermal trade-off between them. Well, in the paper, of course, you will find very detailed description of the methods that were used, but also a test of its application in the case study of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And for the case study of Rotterdam, we were able, by applying the framework, to identify building types and context type, and then further recognize the microclimate pattern through assessment in MVMAT, which is a tool for microclimate simulations. Specifically, we also analyzed the relations between indoor and outdoor temperatures. And we found that some building types, for example, are more sensitive than others to their surrounding. For instance, indoor temperatures in low-rise building sensibly decrease in context of high density, while mid-rise building with small footprints, so for instance, apartment blocks, row houses, are really sensitive to change of the contextual conditions. At the opposite, high-rise buildings are less affected by surrounding changes in form and climate. We further look also at outdoor temperature near facade and reconfirming that higher is the compactness of the building surrounding, lower is air temperature during daytime. And then a second set of results, maybe more general, basis on the morphological approach that we use, which facilitated the understanding of urban form impact on both thermal and aerodynamic patterns at the microscale. So what we observed in general is that the type were able to describe quite a wide range of climate characteristics. Specifically, we measured that building geometry and urban form of the context can bring to 2.5 degree change in air temperature and 3 meters per second change in wind speed. So quite important changes that are due to morphology. So this application therefore suggested that this method can be used to provide insights into the risk of overheating in different urban settings, but can also inform spatial planning. Specifically, we think that the identification of types in niche urban contexts can facilitate the planning of local adaptation measures. For instance, local types can support planners in regulating on building characteristics and can inform also about the microclimate trade-off that the existing context would create in the moment we're going to start to redensify, for example, but can also have designers understanding, for instance, the starting conditions and the space availability in which then they're going to operate. So the green space available, what is the compactness of the urban fabric, so the open space in general available for mitigation measures. Additionally, we also think that this framework can be used as a mapping instrument to define the urgency of intervention and potentially can become a common base to identify responsibility in its risk management for the public and the private sector. Now, as I said, we have applied this framework on the city of Rotterdam, but of course, this is a first application. So we hope to evaluate it further with municipality and test it on more cities. However, when applied to other climate and geographical context, the method will contribute to characterize local climate types, but we are not aiming to identify types that are present worldwide. Rather, we are interested in offering an approach that can acknowledge spatial heterogeneity and its climate performance. So in other words, the method applied in other contexts might bring to different types that are specific to the cultural and geographic context. So let me conclude just saying that, as I said, we would like to have more evaluation application of this method and to test the framework in other contexts. And we are open also to start new collaborations in this regards.
Right. So, well, thanks. Thanks a lot for inviting me or JPA Urban Europe to this. Jonas, Bylund, I'm in the Joint Programming Initiative Urban Europe's Management Board, and my role is, apart from strategic networking, shaping opportunities in different ways for how we work with this, also kind of research and innovation, let's say more thematic content, although I'm not at all an expert in these matters. So just a caution, right? I may say stupid and clumsy things in a moment, right? JPA Urban Europe, for those who are not familiar with it, which is probably the great majority, is a transnational programming initiative. We're working with the societal challenge of sustainable urbanization or urban transformations. And we do that by helping, let's say, 20+ countries in Europe, mainly. But that means also about 40+ funding agencies and ministries to kind of go together with their national programming contexts around, well, urban development, sustainable urban development in different ways, which means we have kind of a broad spectrum from very academic funders to very much applied or innovation type funders, right? But it also means that we have some who are more in the engineering aspects and others are more in the social sciences and humanistics. How do you say that? SSH, I think, is the Brussels jargon for it. Right, and we've just, I may look a bit tired because we are in a kind of a post-deadline fatigue at the moment. We just handed in a proposal for a European partnership. So with that, I mean, we are actually not under the European Union in that way, but we're actually member states. And we are partnering with the European Commission quite a lot in shaping funding opportunities, but we're not under it. So now we are also setting up a European partnership, the only one that is actually mainly focused on, let's say, the urban dimension, urban sustainable development in a way. It's called Driving Urban Transitions to a Sustainable Future. But you can just say the urban partnership. I think people will start to understand what we mean by that. Anyways, that's a kind of what we have in line for the next 7 years. And of course, a lot of these issues that you have been talking about are kind of hard in this. So just to recap a bit, the special issue, so it pivots around climate adaptation of cities, which is very much a kind of a deserving kind of a hot topic. Of course, some people are saying, well, we still need a lot of mitigation, but yes, climate change adaptation is kind of one of the really big things coming on now, and especially when we're talking about urban governance situations. A lot of technical solutions systems are probably out there. Of course, it's difficult to implement or translate it into local areas, but that's kind of the governance situation then, the planning situation, more or less, right? So it's interesting to see the special issue as a kind of a spot on in that focus, but also the kind of making an issue around smart tools and its embedding in smart urban governance, which I think is something that merits a lot of discussion and debate, reflexive, lots of studies, but also lots of trial and error, I guess, at the moment. So it's, I think that the special issue is also kind of part in that context. And then I was thinking a little bit about Juliane and Daniela, your two presentations or your interventions from your papers. One or two things that I just picked up briefly from right here. The one is the challenge to implement new tools in municipalities. That's something I think we could really hold on to for a minute. But also that municipalities are challenged in designing climate action plans. That's a kind of a very interesting situation as well. Both of these, right? New tools, but also they're finding it difficult to do what they have been doing for the last 100, 200 years of modern planning, right? Shaping plans. And maybe we could come back to that. To be a bit brief, and perhaps a bit sorry to say, in a way, JPI Urban Europe don't really have one position around smart tools, smart solutions, smart cities even. This position is a bit different from different contexts that we are working on, different thematic kind of challenges or issues or concerns, different dilemmas even. Sometimes the smart stuff is seen as part of the solution, sometimes it's actually seen as part of the problem. So, and I think there's nothing radical in that. It's just JPI Urban Europe as a kind of a network organization also kind of reflects that in a way. So you may find kind of different approaches under the same umbrella. So this is also a caveat. It might be a bit more of kind of what I'm trying to understand with, let's say, 10 years of smart now, right? Before that, it was, of course, intelligent, I guess, most of the times. One thing that I always started wondering about 5, 6 years ago was what kind of smart do we need? There's one thing that there is a lot of digital stuff out there, lots of interesting stuff, fascinating, speculative, etc. But I think there is always this question, well, hey, wait a minute, what smart do we actually need? And I think that the papers in your collection is also kind of part of that, trying to talk about what we actually need, right? So I'm having a positive reading of that. But I think this question always merits to be asked when we're talking about smart, because it has a history that is not always easy to navigate in the policy landscape. But perhaps also when we're talking about smart, do we only talk about the digital stuff or the, let's say, a certain kind of technology, a sense of certain kind of technology, or do we talk about smart in the sense of interconnecting different aspects, which is what the digital stuff actually does. It connects, right? If you're thinking about the typical dashboard, yes, it's a way of connecting very different flows of information, perhaps, and trying to shape a potential of shaping knowledge from that. But it could also be in different types of nexi. If you're talking about food, water, energy nexus, that has been quite common, or in urban Europe at least. There is also a sense where you could start looking at that from an integrated point of view easier with these types of tools, perhaps. But we could also talk about political infrastructures and democracy. Is that also a way where we can start connecting a lot more? And what kinds of technologies do we need to use? Is it only the digital, or is it other types of technologies as well? So, but it's clear that different smart tools are a kind of it's part of what we're seeing more and more as infrastructure. Just like political discussion is an infrastructure to build cohesion, hopefully. If you do it right, but also like water infrastructure or housing infrastructure. The cities we live in need a lot of different types of infrastructures and kind of connections between different infrastructures as well, right? So I think in that context, you always need to ask, so what kind of smart stuff do we need? Oh, that's one thing. Now, another thing then during this last decade was perhaps that a lot of the smart stuff initially was developed for commercial actors, for companies and business, right? So that was a problem in the first kind of optimism. Hey, so it works with the companies, maybe the public administrations, they can just use it. And of course, that perhaps, I don't know where the verdict is nowadays, but a lot of papers started talking about a lot of lock-in stuff happening. So that's something we probably should learn. It's interesting to see that I think the initiative has nowadays shifted from, let's say, large IT actors pushing smart tools to perhaps city administrations, etc., urban governance actually being proactive and starting shaping what they actually need. And in that sense, shaping a very different sense of smart nowadays than just 5 years ago. So, but I'm still looking out for papers on this, see how it's going, because it's not always easy to see, right? Then there was also, I remember a comment from 1 or 2 mayors out there when some of the smart stuff it is positioned as decision-making support, and the mayors were a bit offended. So I know how to do decisions. I don't need support in that. I need support in many other aspects, but not in decision-making. So, you know, that's also kind of a thing to think about. I don't know, maybe I should start rounding off. I have a couple of other things, but I guess also what we actually need a lot is, again, when we're thinking about connections, but also that, let's say, the urban dimension, it's made up of very different types of knowledge practices, and not just the academic, the engineering sectors, right? But also different types of urban actors and civil society, very different types of experiences, very different ways of trying to communicate, etc. So can we think of smart tools to also make synthesis or shaping what is common, what we have in common and what we may not have in common, but still need to understand, so to speak? Also thinking about the very, very complex climate issues, right? Because that's something that is debated. It should be perhaps debated still. How do we deal with that? Those kinds of very intricate scientific challenges, so to speak, right? These very complex systems that we are dealing with constantly. And there may be that we actually, in order to make our cities work with them and for, you know, ordinary people, so to speak, we need also different ways of communicating and shaping that. So a kind of synthesis approach would be interesting to see more of. As a smart stuff as a knowledge broker, perhaps, I don't know. Yeah, then I was just thinking about, I talked to, let's say, a smart tech strategist from Portland, Oregon, a couple of years ago. And he said his solution, or the city of Portland's solution, was to simply move their IT department into the planning department in order for the IT department to, who are doing all this smart stuff, to actually understand what planners actually do in order to make it work. And I think maybe that's also something. I'm not sure how many cities have the resources to do that, but it might be something to think about when we are developing all of these tools and so. And I think I leave it there. I don't think I got, maybe leave some more time for discussion perhaps. Thank you very much.
Great. I will jump in instead of Rodrigo because he has some technical issue. I would like to open the floor to everyone if there are some questions. If not, there have been some in advance, some questions, and I can read them because afterwards we will put this on a YouTube channel so everyone on the world can see it. We will get millions of clicks, of course. The question or the main point is, the first thing was like the issue between, as also Jonas said, between small village, big, really large cities. When we talk about Ho Chi Minh City with 25 million people, where we have informal settlements and stuff, a really issue to a really small ones where you have maybe 200 people there. And there's one guy who is responsible for everything, for disaster risk management, to climate change adaptation, to mitigation. And he's always worrying us why I have in the hell again a tool to use because I'm not surviving it. And then the question is to Juliane and Daniela, because you worked in both areas a little bit, what is your experience and feelings between this, let's say, strong conflicts between large urban areas, maybe with some resources in the global north, global south, and also in the rural side?
Maybe I can just start off and you continue, Daniela? Okay, perfect. That's a really interesting question, and also all the thoughts from Jonas. Thank you for all the connecting thoughts, because I think that's the big point, especially also in rural areas. How on the one side, for the analysis side, how much different data can we connect before it gets too complex? So we have a lot of data, but how many indicators, how many things do we connect with each other before you have a result that nobody really understands unless you really work with it for a long time? So I think that's also really important in rural areas where you, as you said, maybe only have one person who's responsible. So first you need to make the issue a bit smaller before you make it really big and complex. And the second thing also, especially maybe for rural areas, is the connection after the analysis. So it's first, how much data can we connect within the analysis, but then how can we connect the analysis to the process, and maybe most important, to the funding? Because in rural areas, there's a big problem in funding. Often they don't even know about funding programs, maybe also because they're not very visible. But in the Netherlands, they had this really clear process where the analysis was the basis. And if you make the analysis, you also have access to the funding. So here also a connection of different steps for climate adaptation is really important to achieve the goal. To connect the different steps to each other, to build up on the different steps, to then achieve climate adaptation as a goal. And I think especially in rural areas, we need to really structure this. We need to bring people together to share knowledge as well, because one person alone, it's not possible, it's overwhelming, it's not, and it's not logical either, because we have so much information, we know so much. So connecting these people who maybe work more isolated on a subject in smaller municipalities, connecting them and starting this process together, for me, that's a really important learning, and something that I would like to also establish maybe here in North Rhine-Westphalia or Germany.
Yeah, I really agree with you, Juliane, on these reflections. I will add maybe a couple. I've been mainly working on urban areas, not so much on rural ones, but we have seen also in projects in which we had a collaboration with small municipalities in the Netherlands. We have seen indeed a difference, and that's both, I would say, there are several levels. One is for sure like the space for adaptation, so the conflicts that might emerge in the moment we have to plan and divide also in the management what is the responsibility of the private and the public, and these conflicts emerge I would say more in compact and dense urban environments, but also that the space available means physically what is the space available for mitigation measures, and and I would say the scarcity of space to apply mitigation measure means also having clear data about let's say whole infrastructure system in the subsoil. Again, the ownership, what can be done if there are other projects that are landing in that space, or for example, the energy transition. It's also so the application, or let's say the use of space to produce energy in a clean way. It's also in urban environments another element of a discussion about the space and how. Now, the allocation of measures in that sense. So I would say this is a first element. But then, of course, there is also the economic capacity and the knowledge capacity of the municipalities. And there are a lot of economic pressures as well acting. And those pressures, I would say, are stronger in compact and in mega cities or in bigger cities. And the economic pressure of, for example, we are now in the Netherlands experiencing shortage of houses. So there is a governmental plan to increase residential units in the Randstad and not only. And of course, this is setting the agenda, the political agenda, but also the agenda of the municipalities, which means that the economic driver and let's say the real need of new houses is then putting in a second place the space and the time of the people working at the municipalities for mitigation adaptation measures. So there is also there, I would say, a conflict between the different spheres and what is urgent and necessary in the short term and what is necessary in the long term. And unfortunately, I would say adaptation to climate change is still not considered to be urgent to some extent. We see that also in the application of, as I mentioned before, in the development of climate action plans, how these are intended. They're mainly intended as, again, mitigation measures. So we cut CO2 measures to, reach the targets at the national and the city level. So yeah, I think these, I would say, are the main differences between rural, more, let's say, village, small cities and large ones. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Then there is one question in the chat, a very interesting one, and the very critical ones that we have to think about. And also for us, for the organizing, especially, is quite a challenge. Is the question about smart cities are more than, as also Jonas said, more than only technical advices. It's not only like we have our smartphones connecting each other and everyone is happy, but this is a little bit more than the techniques. Did you, both of you, had an experience on the question about social equity, social inclusion, social exclusions can be also organized by smart cities? What is what were your concerns when you studied this research in the last couple of years and writing these papers? Had you faced some issues like in that direction going on? No.
I'm definitely not the expert for smart city, so I'm not sure if I'm on the right track, but I would totally agree that it's not just about the new tool or the technical intervention. And we figured out if it's about like governance and stakeholders and how stakeholders work together. Firstly, obviously, it's quite a challenge to get them all on a round table, but to have one positive side of Corona, we changed the whole process into the obviously online space. And that was really helpful because I think we could reach many more stakeholders who participated in the whole workshops. And maybe that's also part of a development, how you reach many people. For example, people working in agriculture, they don't get paid to attend a workshop. They don't get paid to attend a workshop like this. So why should they attend? And what time of the day do they attend? And how do we reach them? And these questions, for me also during Corona and working online, it became quite a learning that maybe that's also part of smart solutions. Where do we meet? When do we meet? And how do we get different stakeholders that work at different time of the day and are free on different times of the day to work together on one table? And that was quite a learning for us, definitely.
Yeah, I would say also, just to add on what Juliane said, in the last years we have seen a lot attempt also from our side, like research side, to include more and more stakeholders, but also citizens in these processes of transformation. So not really had a high level of making a plan, but still like in, let's say, smaller projects at the district scale where it's easier to engage citizens. But also there, for example, producing data together. Ask citizens to help also with the data collection. In our case, like climate data. It means, of course, to give a basic information to everyone, so basic like knowledge on the tools, on what they're going to do, but also how then these data are going to be used, and what that means, let's say what their participation means. And it's very difficult, the engaging, let's say, to a larger level. So of course you will always find citizens that are open to these processes, but it is very difficult, the engaging, for time issues, as Juliane said. But I would say it's also how a researcher, this is another level, like how a researcher is perceived. I mean, and this is at all the levels, also at the city level. It's a space that they own, they have a cultural, social attachment to it, and of course they want to improve it. But somehow we are arriving with an external view on it. So also being accepted in this process is the other way around. It's not like they participate to our research, but we are going to study their own lands, their own space where they have attachment. So it's a reciprocal process of acceptance.
Just as an addition, Daniela, I really like your idea, because the people who participate, I think we need to see them as the experts for their subject. And it's so important to have this perspective and to learn from all the knowledge, because we bring things together, but we need the experts and the local knowledge to really process and proceed.
Yeah, and can I just, thinking about the question that was in the chat, smart cities as more than a technological exercise. I think that's something that, of course, we've always been thinking about, I guess, also before smart stuff. There's always been, well, it was intelligent cities and cybernetic cities in the 70s, and it goes way back to ways of how we understand society and technology relations in general. And of course, it's not easy to separate anyways from the beginning. So, but usually what I thought about smart cities a lot in the last decade was that, of course, smart stuff is more like, it's not an end in itself, but hopefully it's helpful means to achieve, for example, sustainable urbanization or climate adaptation, resilience, however you want to put those kinds of other goals, right? Livability, quality of life, etc. But of course, among some context actors, smart cities became kind of an end in itself, and that was kind of a bit troublesome, because it also shaped it as a cluster, kind of isolated from the rest of the urbanist debates and developments, etc. Right? I remember, well, there was a very good network analysis on publications done, a paper in journal Cleaner, sorry, I don't remember the journal name, but De Jong and Schraven and the gang, they made an interesting kind of network analysis on publication keywords, and it was quite obvious that the urban sustainability discourse had a wide kind of network between different classes, and then you had smart cities like on its own, more or less, not many connections in terms of referencing each other's materials, and that's always kind of that's always a bit difficult if you're trying to do integrated urban development, because smart cities was also very popular in many national programming situations, because it had to do with export opportunities, etc., that you want to support. So it still had a very kind of a push, and to try to reintegrate and try to, okay, this is urban development, so you just can't do your own thing, right? It won't work. It's a classic in kind of urban development, right? But a couple of perhaps positive aspects is also, I think it was Berlin after 2015, the last kind of great wave of forced displacement from the Middle East, where newcomers to the city were just given kind of cheap cellular phones with some, I think, smartphones, right? And with some apps that could just help them to navigate where do you need to go, but also help to coordinate with volunteers. And I guess that would have been very much needed in many other cities around in Europe, not least Stockholm, because the public administrations, they had no chance dealing with that. It was all kind of voluntary based activism going on in order to help newcomers to, you know, find a bed, find clean clothes, everything, right? So that's where you also have some of the very positive aspects, I guess. Also, of course, there are the kind of more broader democracy issues around PPGIS and those kinds of aspects. If we're talking about spatial or land use issues and how we deal with those complexities, and also kind of engaging publics more in a kind of political debate around where do we want to go, how do we do it. So I guess there are also positive issues there. And then I was thinking about, my question is perhaps also, since the special issue revolves also about resilience, how do you connect perhaps thinking about urban development or planning not as fail-safe solutions, which has been the kind of, a lot of modern planning has been trying to find fail-safe solutions, more or less proof things, to do safe to fail situations, because it seems like that's less vulnerable than fail-safe if you're reading some of the resilience literature, right? Experimenting and doing things that are more robust because it's safer to fail. I mean, that sounds, you have to get into the thinking, but a lot of perhaps planning that we actually need in Europe nowadays is that kind of thinking. So how could the smart stuff also help us with that? I leave you with that question.
Very good point. I would like to jump in to try to answer this question, because also there was one of the before we start, there was one of the question about the role of citizens in this whole process, about how to engage it. And I would say it's not only the planners, but in general, what we expect in the last, I would say 10 to 50, 20 years, such as like we call it the behavioral turn. So it's not like the state is covering everything. Such as like if you go flood risk management in the 1950s, there were the good engineers going there, make some technical mitigation measures, fighting against nature, we're killing the flood wave, stuff like that. Now it's much more like it's more integrated and interactive, but the question is how we engage with them, how we engage especially with vulnerable people. We treat them all the same, such as like previously, there's one strategic plan for everyone, so everyone is taken care, and we make no differences between them. And the question is, what you're answering is that we split up this classical strategic perspective, that we need one plan, that we have one solution, that we have one answer. And what we slowly see is, in general, no, there are more answers, there are more possible solutions, there are different scenarios. And I think that's also the question that one of the Q&A mentioned. It's more than engineers. Engineers are collecting data. Engineers are providing technical, rational solutions. And nowadays it's much more complex, much more different ideas, such like things, are we allowed to fail? Nowadays we are slowly talking about failures, such as like system doesn't work anymore. What does it mean if there, for example, if there is a dike and doesn't work anymore? That 50 years ago, they would shoot you. It's no debate about it. Nowadays, we slowly talk about certain issues, such as like we call it residual risk. There always can happen something. And in particular, how also an issue. What we face in the urban areas is we have different people with different background, different expectations. We know from studies that sometimes in the UK, certain groups say, well, 20 centimeters of water, who cares? If I'm come from, there is no infrastructure, I wouldn't die. But in UK, everything works smartly. And there are other sides, there are grown up this area and said, well, 20 centimeters of water, I'm totally collapsing. That's something that we also face in the urban areas. We have a more multicultural into that. We have different much more different backgrounds, which makes everything a little bit challenge as well, I would say. And what I would say also, that's a little bit maybe moving on, is with smart information or technology or internet or something like that, what we see is that nowadays a lot of people are realizing there is climate change, but it act up something what we didn't expect, and end up fatalism, saying the impact is so strong and we can absolutely do nothing. And here's the question, what I would like to ask also Jonas and Juliane and Daniela, but also particularly to Jonas, is how these different JPI urban projects, there are quite a couple of them, different focus, of course. How was their response or ideas or concepts to overcome this fatalism and saying, well, I can do absolutely nothing. I'm standing there and the wave is coming to me. Are there any ideas, or did you remember something such as like some ideas how we can encourage people, can promote them, how we can inform them? Because it's always research projects what we also had in JPI Urban. And also now at JPI Urban, we publish really nice academia papers that nobody's reading, but something else. Is there, from your perspective, some evaluation about the societal impact? And if yes, how we can improve ourselves as a researcher as well? Because sometimes we are there at the university and say, well, of course, everyone needs to read our policy briefs because they are wonderful. Then we are entering and they said, oh, that's something we cannot respond anymore. It's too much. How we can avoid such things like ending up like in a fatalism that everyone says, no, dear God, it's God and we cannot do anything more. How we can encourage not only public administration, but also citizens. I hope I was a little bit clear, but it's a little bit long statement, sorry about it.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have any good answer to that. Because yeah, we would still need to do a kind of a synthesis across very different types of projects. But in general, one way of looking at it, say, okay, we have had more than 80 urban living labs funded. That's a way of actually working with that kind of engagement and working with not informing, but also, I mean, not just researching on, but actually researching with, and then together exploring these types of questions. And I think the kind of fatalism that you're talking about, or the massive information overload, that could be very good topics to deal with, or ways to. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the urban living labs actually done it more or less as a parallel to other questions. And I'm terribly sorry, but I also need to go because I actually need to catch transport to another country soon.
Thank you very much, Jonas. Last comment from Juliane or Daniela. If not, we are overrunning time and we have to slowly close down. If not, my kids are killing me. Sorry. It's always the same.
Maybe just a very short idea. It's not very close to my current research, but I saw a paper quite a while ago, and it was about a communication of climate adaptation measures. And that was really impressive for me because it was a picture like, what if we do climate adaptation and what if we don't? And the picture that climate adaptation is more than adaptation, but it's creating a space that it's worth living. It's green, it's open, it's more than climate adaptation. And I think if we transport the message that it's not just about climate adaptation, but making spaces that are worth living and that are good for people and that are nice for people, I think then we can transport that it's more than responding to climate change. And I think that might also help if we say, oh, why should we do this? It's more than that. And I think maybe that's a picture that helps. So if it doesn't get as bad as we think it does, we still have a nice green place to live. And maybe that's the better solution than doing nothing and not acting. I quite like that picture, actually.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Rodrigo, Juliane, Daniela, and Thomas.
Thank you, Jonas.
I need to log off.
Bye, Jonas.
Bye. I also need to go shortly. I think my answer to your question, Thomas, it's we still need prioritizations. We still need like to set the agenda differently. Again, as I said before, the projects also, I was also involved in a project funded by the GPI Urban Europe, and it was about smart cities. 2016 was the call. But then what happened is that through the projects, you are able to develop the tool and you know, evolve knowledge and work with the communities. But then the time is, you know, very short. And again, there is not a priority for the municipalities to really push it further. So I think the prioritization from the municipalities it's extremely important. And I think adaptation should even, you know, go on top of the list before new development planning. Before like everything else, but unfortunately it's not like that still.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much for attending. I think, Rodrigo, you are now closing the session. I would like to say thanks a lot. Read our special issues, especially papers from Juliane and Daniela, and hopefully see you soon. Bye, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.